I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Oh, what a difference a couple weeks makes, or heck, just a day. A few weeks ago on this very program, we talked about how the fire season hadn't been so bad, and well, things certainly changed. And here to talk about it is Courtney Flatt. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Courtney, among the many topics you cover is, of course, fire and all the associated things that comes with it. And maybe we begin with a little mea culpa of sorts. Like I said, you and I talked about how the fire season by late August hadn't been too bad in the Northwest, and then certainly things changed. Perhaps we jinxed it. So on that note, what really changed? Were things really just not that bad, and then suddenly overnight they changed, or what really happened?
Things were already really bad. And by that, I mean the vegetation throughout Washington, the stuff that burns and fuels wildfires, was really, really dry. And then on Labor Day, really strong winds pushed through the area. Forecasters knew this was going to happen, and they pleaded with people to not start wildfires over the holiday weekend. And on Sunday and Monday, fires were started, and it was just really impossible for firefighters to catch once the winds pushed through.
All right. And, the term that gets thrown around so much, of course, in these times is climate change. And there's a whole set of political debates about that we're not going to get into now. But really, what part of the conversation about these fires and just all the things that we've seen over the past few years can really be attributed to climate change? How does that enter into the conversation?
Well, you can't really attribute any one event to climate change, but climate change is going to make fire seasons longer and more severe. And one of the researchers I spoke to said a big reason that this is going to happen is because forests are going to be drier and ready to burn. And there are a lot of things that contribute to forest dryness, things like the timing of snowpack, spring and summer precipitation, and heat. And all of that's going to change with climate change. So that just means that our wet forests are going to burn more often, kind of like what we're seeing on the western side of the state right now. That could maybe become more of a new normal. Another thing to note is that after all of that said, less is known about what that means for our large rangeland fires.
Right. And we should note that many of the fires that happen or are happening in eastern and central Washington recently are not forest fires. They're the rangeland, brush and grass and those sorts of things. And those tend to move very fast and spread very quickly, as we saw, because of the winds. So also, you reported recently about how odd it was for this sort of late season fire event to happen. Of course, normally we're used to bigger fire events in July, maybe earlier in August, when things are really hot and super dry then. And usually the fire season starts to wind down, not just over Labor Day weekend, but as you get into the later part of the summer. That's certainly different this year. And in California, of course, it's a little different. They often see big fires later in the year into the fall because of just how the climate works there. But Washington and the Northwest is generally pretty different, except this year, of course. And I wonder if this is an anomaly this year, or can we become more accustomed to having the fire season be pretty bad, even into the late summer and early fall?
Yeah, so this year is really unusual that fires are ramping up now. Like you said, it's not what we normally see. Typically in September, crews are starting to breathe a little easier, and they're not really trying to catch fires as much as manage them, even though there are some fires that can start in September. As we saw, that didn't happen this year. And forecasters say this year in particular, what we're going to need is a lot more precipitation to get back to new normal. And probably it'll be a while for an end of fire season storm that will kind of stop things and help calm things down. In the long term, fire seasons are going to be longer as the climate changes. And so we probably long term will see more fires this time of year.
I know it's sort of cliche to say, but this just seems extraordinary and incredible. I mean, nearly 300,000 acres in Washington state burned in a single day. That just seems unfathomable, but it did actually happen. I wonder, is it really all that unprecedented, or do you think there are some lessons to be learned here going forward? You've covered this a lot. What's your perspective?
Yeah, officials are calling this a really historic and unprecedented event. But one thing that they are comparing it to is a really infamous fire season, which is often referred to as the Big Burn. And it happened in 1910. That more than 100 fires were started kind of at the beginning of the summer as trains went through really dry forests and sparked fires. Then in August, hurricane force winds pushed through the area and just made everything go out of control in Montana and northern Idaho. In the end, 86 people died and more than 3 million acres were burned. And in the aftermath, that kind of really shaped our forest management practices and our firefighting practices that we've seen up until today. It ushered in an era of about 100 years of keeping fire off of the land. And that sort of fire suppression has led to really large wildfires that we've seen across the West. When that's combined with people living near fire-prone areas, lots more droughts, really hot fire seasons, it can just all combine for this like perfect storm that creates really critical conditions, especially when weather like we saw on Labor Day pushes through with really strong winds that just fan the flames and make things go out of control.
You covered some of these big fires of the last 10 years in the Northwest. 2014, the Carlton Complex, 2015, the Okanagan Complex, both back-to-back years in north central Washington. Many of the same areas burned. And of course, now we're seeing that again in north central Washington, some of the same areas burning once again. What, from a state policy perspective, fire management at the state and federal levels, sort of came out of those years and is still being employed today?
After the 2014 and 2015 fire seasons, the State Department of Natural Resources created a wildland fire protection plan. There are a lot of parts to this plan, but one part is to create healthier forests. There are a lot of areas that are really dense and that will need thinning and more prescribed burns. That's fire that works like it naturally would to get rid of excessive brush and debris that fuel fires. This makes fires more resilient. Fire is really often good and needed on the landscape, but it's these extremely hot and destructive wildfires fueled by too much vegetation that threaten people and property. And so another part of this plan is to make communities more fire-wise. That's things like protecting your property, keeping vegetation that's flammable away from your houses, putting fire-resistant roofing like metal shingles on top of your house, keeping flammable material off of your decks and porches. And then there's also a third prong to this, which is getting more funding for our wildland firefighting capabilities. And after this fire season, that's something that politicians are already starting to push for more funding right now for these sorts of things. And then one final thing that is really kind of related to what's going on right now is that officials are hoping to reduce unwanted human-caused fires. That could be anything from chains on the back of a car dragging along the highway creating sparks, or people doing target practice. And what happened on Labor Day is that all of these fires, most of them are probably going to be human caused. Fire officials are still investigating exactly what happened, but there's really one common factor, and that was people.
We hope that we don't have to have you come on anymore to talk about explosive fires that are happening in the region, and maybe more about fire management and policy rather than the big burn that's happening right now. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You can see more wildfire news and updates and other resources at our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.